To say that Vitality had a good end to last season would be like saying LeBron James has had a good basketball career. Sure, that's technically right, but it does not do it justice. LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time, and those boys on Vitality had the single best split that we've seen since the Open era started in RLCS X. And then they capped off that split with a dominant World Championship victory. And if you want to go back even further than that, then you could argue that their spring split and World Championship was better than any season that a team had during the old format too, with the only other team in contention being that Season 4 to Season 5 Dignitas team. But from the standpoint of winning games, Vitality has the edge. In both Season 4 and Season 5, including the World Championships, that Dignitas roster won 12 out of 14 series that they played, giving them a series winning percentage of 86%. But starting from the last spring split, where Vitality won all 3 regionals, the Major, and the World Championship on top of that, Vitality won 25 out of 27 series, giving them a win percentage of 92. But regardless of how they compare, the main point is that Vitality was the best team in the world by far. Fast forward to this season though, and this Vitality team is good, which isn't bad, obviously, but it's a big step down from being the best team in the world by far. In the 18 series they've played so far this season, Vitality have 5 losses, with 2 of them being to teams that you'd expect them to beat every time, in 100% and sub. No disrespect to Crispy though, because he's the GOAT. Because he's in my Discord, which you should be too. This gives them a series winning percentage of just 72, and lands them in a tie for 4th place heading into the last event for major qualification. For most of the teams in the world, this would be an incredible position, but in Vitality's case, it has to be pretty disappointing. So what's the problem here? Is the Vitality falling off and becoming a worse team now that their honeymoon period's over? Or is it a case of the other teams in the region catching up to their level that's making them look so pedestrian? Well, as is the case with most arguments, there's some truth to both sides. And I want to emphasize most here because I've been in some arguments where one side has no truth at all and they're just completely wrong. And if you're asking if I was the one person that was wrong in that situation, I'm gonna need you to mind your business, alright? Thank you. So yeah, RLCS is back, Furia qualified for the Major, I'm making videos again, and we're talking about Rocket League. So, let's get into it. As always, I think the best place to start off with this team is taking a look at what they did so well last season to put them on top of the world. One thing that I like to do in analyzing teams is figure out the difference in playstyles between each of their individual players, and I'll use stats as a key point of reference to back that up. Like I'll say one player is more passive and spends a lot of time on the defensive side of the field, or I'll look at some other stat like goals, assists, average speed, or whatever, and I'll couple that with on-field analysis to come to a conclusion. But this approach kind of fell apart when it came to Vitality last season because their players all had a very similar stat profile. In goals per game, they were all within 0.1 of each other. For saves, they were within 0.3, and for shots, they were within 0.36. Oddly enough, the difference in their assist numbers was the quote-unquote biggest, because despite being only 0.18 apart from each other in that stat, the lower volume of assists we see in general makes this difference more impactful. Put simply, despite being 0.36 apart, Zen was 3rd in shots among European players, and Radosin was 20th. But in assists, where they were only 0.18 apart, Zen was 11th, and Radosin was all the way down to 40th out of European players. But even with the differences that we saw in their core stats, they were still a lot closer in almost all of them than we see out of a lot of other teams. This was even true for their positioning stats. At the beginning of last season's spring split, there was a trend of Radosin being the farthest back and Alpha being the farthest forward most often. But as the split went on, and they spent more time together, they gradually broke away from that trend, to the point where in the spring major, Zen actually spent the most time in the 3rd man spot. And then in the World Championship, all 3 of their players were in the 1st man or 3rd man position either 32, 33, or 34% of the time. The only way you can get more balance than that is to have a perfect 33 in each position, which I haven't seen yet. So I'll just go ahead and say that this Vitality team in the World Championship was the most positionally balanced I'd ever seen. In order for a team to be great in the modern era of Rocket League, you need every player to be confident and impactful in every position of the field. And that is something this Vitality team had more than anybody else. And the coolest part about them is that even though the stats were so balanced for this team, when you watch them, you could still see their individuality on display, with how they would react to the play depending on where they were on the field. Just because they split responsibilities equally didn't mean that they would all do the exact same thing every time. If we focus on the offensive side, Alpha was the guy who would most often look to take a direct line to the opponent's goal when he got the ball, often doing so as fast as possible. But it never seemed like he was taking a shot just for the sake of taking a shot. or just absentmindedly going to the goal like you've seen some people do in your Champ 2 lobbies. The main thing he would accomplish with these plays would be compounding the pressure on the defense and putting them in a spot where it would be hard for them to recover for one of his teammates' follow-up. And as a result, most of the assists that Alpha would get would be from a teammate cleaning up from a defender's touch after Alpha either took his own shot or made a really hard hit towards the opponent's net, rather than Alpha passing it directly to that teammate. And I would say it's also why Alpha had slightly more shots per game than his teammates and a slightly faster average speed. The differences here weren't that big, but a subtle playstyle difference on the field leads to a subtle difference in the stat sheet too. In Zen's case, the thing that would separate him would be how much control he would maintain over the ball when he got it. He would try to keep it close, and then try to get as many touches as possible in an effort to get a clean beat on whoever was trying to contest him. If Alpha was the sledgehammer trying to brute force his way through the opponents, then Zen was the scalpel, carving them up with as much precision as possible. This is a very difficult way to play the game, especially at the pro level, but if you have the mechanics to support it, then it can work out very well for you. And of course, it ended up working out for Zen. And finally for Radosin, it seemed like he would take a more defensive approach when he was on offense, meaning he would often just try to keep the ball on the offensive side of the field when the defense got a touch. And with Zen and Alpha being the guys who took the ball upfield most of the time, Radosin would be lingering around behind them, ready to either take a follow-up shot or do what he can to keep the ball on offense. This is why Radosin spent the most time in the third man position on the team, and it also explains why even though all of their players have a similar average ball distance, when they have possession, Radosin has the farthest ball distance, and then when they lose it, he has the closest. A lot of the time when Vitality had the ball, Radosin would be farther away while he supported his teammates from afar. But then when they lost it, he would be the one to swoop in, looking to either win it back or slow down the counterattack as much as he could before diving in after his teammates were in a safer position. But there were also, of course, plenty of times when he would have possession of the ball himself, and when he did, he was closer to Zen than he was Alpha, in the sense that he would go for more control and outplays than he would go for pure speed. A lot of the time, that control would show up with Radosin going for a controlled 50 to keep possession for his team. But if he went for an outplay, he was more than capable of making a really good one. All of what I just said is only part of what made this team so great last season. I haven't even touched on how they had the best defense in the region by a huge margin, or how it seemed like they would get a perfect 50 every single time they went for one, or how they would manage to use each other in ways that nobody could see coming, especially not the defense. But we've already spent enough time on the past. The most important thing to discuss for this video is what's going on with the team right now. They're still really good, and even though they're only in the tie for the 4th and final European major spot, I would say that most people expect them to still get that spot. But regardless, they're still having their issues. And the first real issue for this team was that they were having some real struggles on offense, and that they weren't scoring with the same consistency that they were last season. The overall stats are deceiving for this, because in terms of goals per game, in the first event of this season, Vitality actually had more goals than they had in the final part of last season. But even with this higher number, you could still tell the consistency wasn't there for them as a team, because they would have series like the ones against Belagol and Moist, where they would have a game with 7 goals and average over 3 goals per game in those series, but then they would have a series like the one against 100%, where they got shut out in 2 different games and they only had 1 goal in another, on their way to a series loss in 5 games. And their later series against Redemption wasn't much more encouraging. They were shut out once, and they were held to 1 goal in 2 other games. They did eventually get a 6-goal outburst in Game 5 to bump up their average and get the series win, but if anything, that was just another indication of the problem. Last season's greatness was because of sustained excellence every time they got on the pitch, but this season, they're mixing some really good games with some really bad games, which is why they're beginning to take losses that we would never expect. And the most frustrating part is that it didn't even seem like there was an easy fix to their mistakes. It's not like any of the players got outside of their comfort zones or started playing in a way that you wouldn't expect them to. If one player starts being too ball chasey or is being too passive, that's a pretty easy fix. Just say, stop doing that. But Vitality's players were all still playing pretty close to the way they did last season, more or less. The only difference is that now they would be in a position to make a play, and they just wouldn't make it. I don't mean to single them out because they all have their issues, but in the first tournament, Alpha had an especially tough outing. His mistakes started to pile up after a while, which was a big reason for him having the 5th fewest goals he's ever had in an RLCS event, which in turn required Zen to step up his own scoring individually to keep Vitality on pace with where they wanted to be. This play against 100% is a prime example of the simple mistakes they would make. Alpha beats Triton to the ball, then Zen beats Breezy. So now Alpha has a wide open net to shoot on, but then his tendency to shoot quickly takes over, and instead of getting an easy goal, he goes too quick and misreads the ball, hitting it backwards into Radosin instead. If he had held up for just another split second, waiting for the ball to get a little bit further ahead of him, this would have been one of his easiest goals. But instead, we got this. And of course, Radosin has no idea what to do with this, because who could see that coming? So after waiting, he just throws it at the net, and after the save, Vitality's scoring chance is over. But like I said before, it's not like all the mistakes were on Alpha, because a lot of the plays were just a result of miscommunications and Vitality not being on the same page. In this exact same game alone, there were double commits on the sidewall, leading to the end of offensive pushes. We had Zen in a 1v1 scenario against Crispy, who was in goal, where he decides to pass the ball off the back wall infield to literally nobody, which ended that scoring chance. And we even saw an aggressive dive from Radosin of all people from the third man spot, which led to a numbers advantage for 100%, no pun intended, and it gave them a game-winning goal at 0 seconds. And this transitions me into my next point of saying that their inconsistency showed up on defense too, although it wasn't nearly as prominent as it was on the offensive side. The main place where we saw it come up was in their semifinal series against Gentlemates, where they had 3 great games defensively, shutting them out in those, but they had 4 not so great games, where they allowed at least 3 goals, on their way to losing the series in 7 games. In this play, Zen loses the 50 up high, and Radosin needs to make the save. When he makes the touch, he has plenty of time to get the ball safely into the corner, but instead he rushes the play as if he has no time at all, slamming it off the back wall into Itachi, and the ensuing scramble leads to a goal for the Gentlemates. Or you have this play in Game 7, where Alpha's going up against Juicy for the 50, and Zen is so confident that Alpha's going to win it that he turns up the wall looking to receive the pass. But then when Alpha loses it, Zen needs to run back to their own net. Itachi gets the ceiling set up and has plenty of space, so he can do basically whatever he wants with the ball. And with Radosin on the back wall and Zen running back into the goal, they need to figure out what they're going to try to do to stop this play, since they have the choice of defending the net or defending the pass. But they both decide to try to intercept the pass as it comes in, which is tough for both of them, because Itachi keeps it far enough away from the back wall that Radosin really has to stretch for it, and Zen has to come to a dead stop while reading this play, which kills his momentum and makes him slower to the ball when he jumps for it. And since they both went for the interception, this leaves the net completely undefended, so when neither one of them get a touch on the ball, Gentlemates get the Game 7 equalizer and go on to get the win. But even with the on and off tournament Vitality had, they were still able to make it all the way to the semifinals. But given that this was their first RLCS tournament where they didn't win since they picked up Zen, it's still pretty disappointing. Another thing that's very different about this Vitality team compared to last season is that their uncanny statistical balance is pretty much gone. Instead of everybody being really close to each other in every stat, for the first event, Zen had 1.14 goals per game, which was the second most in the entire event, and almost as much as Alpha and Radosin had combined. And on the other side of the field, Alpha had the third most saves per game in the event at 2.38, which is also his 4th highest save total that he's ever had in a single event for his lengthy career. Him having this many saves is unexpected for a couple of reasons. One is because since they picked up Zen, Alpha spent the most time in the first man position and has the fewest saves on the team. So him jumping up to having the most saves in the team by a wide margin is a pretty big shock. But the other reason that this was weird was that Radosin was still in the third man spot more than either of his 2 teammates. In fact, he spent the 8th most time in that position out of all players in the event. Now you might expect the player who spends the most time as the third man to have the most saves, since they're of course the closest to their own net, but it's actually not uncommon for the player who's most often third man to not lead his team in saves. Even in this tournament, out of the 7 players above Radosin who spent more time in the third man position, only 3 of them actually led their team in saves. But this usually wasn't the case for Radosin, because even though the margins were slim because of his team's balance in the past, he would still often spend the most time as third man and have the most saves. So for him to have so many fewer saves than a teammate, especially when that teammate is Alpha, is a pretty big change. But for as weird as the first event was, the second one didn't go much better, especially not at the beginning. They had to go up against K-Corp in the second round of the Swiss, and that got off to a really good start for them, as they took a 2-1 series lead to get to match point. But getting shut out in games 4 and 5 and 1-0 defeats kept them from their best win of the season. And after taking an upset loss to 100% in the first event, they took an upset loss to SA in this one, losing that series in just 4 games. This loss meant that they would go through Swiss with just a 3-2 record, and would now need to face off against K-Corp again for their first match of the playoffs. And after getting shut out in their final 2 games in the Swiss series against K-Corp, Vitality only managed to score 1 goal in the first 2 games of this series, meaning that in the last 4 games against K-Corp, Vitality had only scored 1 goal. And with 2 more lives to go, they called a timeout to re-strategize and find a way past this team. And it kinda worked, because in game 3 they did manage to score 2 goals. But the bad news was that they allowed K-Corp to score 7. 7 is more than 2, and they lost that game. Then game 4 saw Vitality score 3 goals, but they allowed K-Corp to score 6. And with those 2 deflating losses, Vitality lost the series. Right when Vitality came out of their timeout after game 2, you could immediately tell that they started to overthink everything. They were even out of sync on the first kickoff, with Alpha and Radosin both faking the touch while Zen drives off to the corner. giving K-Corp the easiest goal you can score. Or less than a minute later, where Alpha is on his own on defense after Redosin is demoed, Alpha rushes back to the ball and he's the first one to it. So he can try to make a touch to buy just one more second before Redosin respawns, since Zen is out of the picture entirely, grabbing boost on the other side of the field. But instead of making the touch, he fakes it, leaving it for K-Corp instead, which gives them so much time that Rise doesn't even need to take it himself. He can just leave it for Vatira, who slots a perfect shot into the corner. And just like last tournament, the statistical balance that they had last season wasn't there in this tournament. But instead of Zen leading the way, this time it was Alpha who's doing the lion's share of the work on offense, as he led Vitality in goals and assists this event, while just barely missing out on the most saves to Redosin. And just like how it was in the first event, where Zen's scoring uptick seemed to be in response to Alpha's scoring struggles, you could kind of say the same thing about Alpha's scoring uptick in this event in regards to Zen's struggles, although Zen struggled to a much lesser degree. While Alpha struggled for a good portion of the first event, Zen was mostly fine in the second tournament, raking in the goals against lesser teams like you would expect, and still scoring at a rate above or similar to his teammates even in their losses. But there is one exception to this, and it was a big one, because when Vitality got swept by K-Corp, Zen had to have the single worst series that he's had since becoming a pro. In the 4 games, Zen didn't score a single goal, only made 2 saves, and only had 1 assist out of Vitality's 6 goals in that series, which is a wild stat on its own because Rise had 8 goals by himself. But there are plenty of plays where you could see that Zen wasn't up to his usual level. He wasn't doing much to help out his team on defense, and when the ball was on the offensive side of the field, he was struggling to make the impact that we've all come to expect from him. It's good to pop off against teams that you're expected to beat, but showings like this against the new top dog in the region is not going to get the job done. But then you also had plays like this, where Zen literally had no chance at all to make the stop. Even though Vitality wasn't playing up to their standard, with how good K-Corp looks, even if Vitality was in form, they would still be having a really hard time with these guys. So now, we have Vitality in this current situation, with their major hopes in a precarious position. And even if they do qualify for the major, which I'm sure most people are expecting them to, unless they show another level in this third tournament, their expectations won't be very high when they get there. But I'm not counting them out yet, because I know they still have that level in them. But whether or not they actually reach it, I guess we'll have to see. Thanks for watching. Was that point corny? Should I not do that?